Okay, welcome to this tutorial on learning outcomes, standards, and the national trends that shape them. So this week we will really attempt to answer the question, how do you know what you're going to teach? And in that, we'll start out looking at the skills that our students will need to succeed in a much more globalized future and the role that we as STEM educators can play in getting them ready for that. We will also dig a little into the changes that standards, national and state standards, have gone through in the past 5 years, as there's been a much greater emphasis on college and career readiness. And we'll take a little look at curriculum guides, the kinds of resources that once you get a job, that districts will provide for you to help you answer that question, what exactly are you going to teach? I think, some of the hardest aspects of coming up with good learning outcomes is that the future for our students, it is still so uncertain. I graduated high school in the late 1980s, and at that time, if you had asked any of us, and probably a lot of my teachers, what IT was, or what an IT person would do in a career, I don't think many people would have had an answer for that. But fast forward 10 years after I graduated high school, and probably more than half of my friends had very robust careers in IT. So I don't think that's any different now. I think a lot of us have to reflect and realize that we're preparing students for jobs now that we don't even know about yet, and there's so much uncertain about the future. But we can still take a look at the trends that we think might shape our future, and really try to get a feel for what skills our students are going to need to succeed in that world, and then reflect back on our own teaching and figure out how we can prepare them for that. One of the first and probably most obvious trends that'll shape the future for our students is the changing role of various nations in the global economy, particularly that of developing nations such as China. Um, Goldman Sachs now predicts that 2019 is the year that the Chinese economy eclipses the United States and becomes the number one largest consuming economy on the planet. That forecast, I think, originally was 2035 and has been moved up twice and may, in fact, be moved up again. So this moment may actually happen before 2019. But when that happens, um, and we can already start to see changes in the way that companies are marketing products, preparing for that. I think a great example is the manufacturer of motorcycles, Harley Davidson. When we think about Harley Davidson, we think about large, loud motorcycles that you feel in your feet as they rumble down the street. Big, kind of loud American muscle. If you look at some of the new product lines that Harley Davidson is coming out with, they're coming out with electric motorcycles that are almost silent. These are highly efficient, streamlined motorcycles. These bikes are totally contradictory to Harley's marketing program. And the only reason Harley is doing this is they're predicting that in the future, Asia may in fact be a larger market for their motorcycles than the United States. So I think you're going to see a lot of companies following in the same route. It's going to become much more important for students to understand cultures in countries like China, the way they do business, different subtle cultural nuances, how to work with people from these cultures. These kinds of skills will become much more important as economies like China and India become much more influential on the global market. I think probably one of the future trends that probably has the strongest connection to our STEM curriculum is that of energy and the increasing importance of energy in our economy. Not just where we get energy, but infrastructure and the way to distribute energy as well. Solar, wind, and even things like fusion are becoming more and more a part of our economy and the way companies do business. And students are going to have to become more accustomed with these new technologies and try to figure out how best to take advantage of them. I had a superintendent years ago who interviewed me, and when he interviewed me, he asked me a question that really kind of threw me at the time. He asked me, well, he presented me with an imaginary scenario. He said, "What if we surgically implant a chip in the brain of all of your students, and that chip will enable them to recall all the factual information they would ever need?" And then he paused and he said, "If that were to happen, what would you teach them?" Now, our students are not having any chips implanted in their brains anytime soon, but technology such as Google Glass and just Google in general and smartphones really is bombarding our students with massive amounts of information and content, and we can't ignore this trend. Years ago, having content in your mind, being able to memorize facts and terminology were much more important than they are today. It's much more important now that our students know what to do with that content. So I think InfoWhelm is a huge trend that we have to be prepared for, and that in order for our students to have an edge, the application, interpretation, and synthesis with content is going to be much more important than memorizing formulas, facts, etc. The world of autonomous robots and automation in general is another trend which will have a profound impact on the economy that our students are going to be working in. It seems like every year another industry gets automated. If you look at what's gone on in the financial sector and things like accounting, where things like tax returns, all of those things which years ago a person could make a real good income doing are have now become fully automated. It's not that that industry is gone, but now instead of doing tax returns, most people in accounting, the people that are doing well, are more involved with the more strategic aspects of helping companies and individuals know what to do with their money in order to get the most out of it. So smart technology and smart machines are something that our students have to keep an eye on. A lot of students have a very strong interest in things like robotics, and as STEM teachers, we want to definitely cultivate that. This robot to your left, which was created years ago actually by Boston Dynamics, was a prototype that they made for the military in Afghanistan. The military was looking for basically an autonomous pack mule, something that could actually walk with troops and carry up to 500-600 pounds of cargo, ammunition, supplies, etc., and be able to autonomously navigate over very, very, very tricky terrain, rocks, ditches, etc. So Boston Dynamics created Big Dog, which you see here, and Big Dog is able to do something that we take for granted, but is actually a very, very complex thought process, and that is balance. Big Dog has the ability to move over uneven terrain, balance, fall, get up, etc., in a completely autonomous way. One of the things that I would like you to do is you will see a video that's been posted for this week called Flying Autonomous Robots, where you'll get a peek inside of the GRASP laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania's Autonomous Robotics Center in Philadelphia, and you'll get to see what Dr. Vijay Kumar is doing with flying autonomous robots that not only can think for themselves, but as you'll see from the video, in an incredible way, they actually have the ability to work together and collaborate in teams. So I think autonomous robotics and smart technology is changing the way we do business. It seems like every day. This is something that our students need to be aware of, not only from the standpoint of possibly, getting having a career in developing this kind of technology or working with this kind of technology, but the fact that many thought processes are getting automated. And our students have to focus on things that can't be automated and develop those kinds of skills if they're going to succeed in the future. So these technologies are amazing, and these trends are very exciting, and they'll have a very large impact on our economy and on our students in the future. But unfortunately, they won't affect everybody the same way. And I want to talk a little bit about a concept that is called bounty and spread in terms of the way these technologies impact our economy and impact jobs. So there's a great book out of MIT's Center for Digital Business called The Second Machine Age, which really revolves around this concept of bounty and spread and focuses on the kinds of skills our students are going to need to succeed as a result of these kind of technologies, and specifically focusing on automation-oriented or smart machine type technologies. So for some people, who engage in activities at work that are very algorithmic, are rote kind of mechanical tasks, these technologies are going to replace people in those kinds of jobs. And other people who are involved in more creative thought processes will have the ability to embrace these technologies and harness these technologies to actually do more and do it faster. So when we talk about the bounty and spread concept, we're basically saying is for people with the right kinds of skills, these technologies are going to provide bounty. For those who don't possess those kinds of skills, and we're talking about, again, higher level thinking skills, design thinking, creativity skills, those kinds of skills, for people who don't have those, they're looking at being replaced. Another exciting trend in science and technology, with a lot of application actually in chemistry, is that of nanotechnology, or the exploration of inner space. Being able to see, manipulate, and eventually even fabricate objects at a molecular level. This technology is developing rapidly and seems to be changing every year. And this is going to create a whole bunch of new opportunities for students, again, if they possess the right skills. So another great opportunity, particularly I think for chemistry teachers and technology teachers, to really make sure our students have the skills to take advantage of an emerging field like nanotechnology. You know, since the Human Genome Project in the late 1990s, we really are rapidly gaining a greater control of our own biology. And that's another, I think, really exciting trend, and also one that really helps us as STEM teachers make our content relevant. Things like tissue engineering and tailored pharmaceuticals, just it's unbelievable when you think about the new fields that are emerging in this area. You know, we talk about preparing our students for jobs that don't even exist yet, and I think tissue engineering is a great example. There's a video posted for this week where a gentleman, a researcher from Vanderbilt University, is going to show you the details on how they're working on printing prototype human organs, particularly kidneys. And I think when you see this and realize that this actually video, I think, is already almost 5 years old, and realize that these prototypes are being developed and are being implanted in animals as we speak, and you start to ask yourself, how far off are clinical trials in human beings? And again, what kind of new emerging jobs and emerging fields are going to come out of that science? So let's move away from science and technology a little bit, but discuss a trend that is important today and is going to be increasingly important in our students' futures. And it's important for us to think about that and as we kind of create and shape the content and skills that our students need to know. And that's the rising cost of healthcare and wellness in general in this country. Teen obesity rates are now over 30%. Obesity, diabetes, cancer rates seem to be increasing each year. and the cost of healthcare is increasing exponentially. And as a nation, we're having a very, very tough time getting this under control. I don't really see an answer anytime in the future, but I think your students' generation are going to have to come to terms with this and figure out a way for us to become healthier as a nation, for us to embrace wellness more as a nation, and to do that in a much more cost-effective way. If we don't, and if our students don't have the skills to do that, they're going to have a hard time succeeding as an individual. And I think we'll have a nation that's not only going to be less healthy than today, but also bankrupt in the process. So we've been talking about trends that are already happening now. And it really gets interesting when you think about what lies beyond in terms of the trends in science, technology, and the economy. I had an opportunity last year to visit the GRASP laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which I talked a little bit about when we were talking about autonomous robotics. But in addition to autonomous robotics, they also have a haptics lab there. And haptics is the technology of transmitting tactile sensation through computer networks, sensations of temperature, pressure, and texture. The picture you see in front of you is actually a haptic demonstrator that's used to train surgeons, and I've actually had the opportunity to work with this, and it's unbelievable. In the picture, you see a person using those two pen-like devices almost as virtual scalpels, and on the screen there, they're cutting tissue and performing a surgery. When you do that, when you actually use those virtual pens, those virtual scalpels, you feel the sensation of cutting through tissue. You feel resistance, you feel pressure, you feel bumps when you hit bone. It's an amazing technology that has incredible potential for applications in a variety of fields. And that's just one, I think, of the technologies that's out there when you talk about what lies beyond. So we have to help our students become aware of these possibilities and really become lifelong learners and staying ahead of the game and really be good at projecting what's going to be big 5, 10, 15 years out. As you can see by this graph, and this graph is obviously 5 years old now, in terms of the growth of Facebook, and I have young teenagers myself, and I know Facebook already seems to be becoming passe with them as they're moving on and making more use of social media like Instagram and a variety of other technologies. But social media is completely changing the way we interact. It's presenting a lot of challenges for our students, particularly in their development of communication skills. So this is another trend that as teachers we have to be aware of and help students develop the skills they need to use social media in not only an entrepreneurial way, but also in a socially responsible way, in a way that actually enhances their communication, not inhibit it. So what does this all mean for us as teachers? I mean, it's always interesting to think about trends and look at new technologies and developments in science and think about the sociological implications of them. But what's really important for us as a practical sense as teachers is all of this should help us answer the question, what do we teach? And that's what this is all about. It's what this week is all about. So I want you to think about some of the things you just heard and think about those trends shaping the future for your students. And then sit back and ask yourself, what skills are going to be the most essential for my students if they're going to succeed in this future? And try to kind of lay some of those out. Maybe even take a minute and stop this tutorial and lay them out on paper before you proceed on. So as you were thinking through that question and trying to identify skills that will be essential for our students, possibly one of the ones you came to was creativity. In this changing world, it's more important than ever that our students can think out of the box. And that's something that, as teachers, we're going to have to help our students with. The kind of daunting aspect of this is that if you look at the research going on in this country about the creativity level of our students, you'll see that it's been steadily declining since the early 1990s. And there's a lot of potential roots of that problem that we could debate forever, whether it's video games or social media or the fact that too much of children's time is structured and go on and on. There's a lot being written about all of those things, and we could argue about that. But the bottom line is our students are actually less creative now than they were 20 years ago. At a time when you consider the trends we've discussed, that they're going to need to be even more creative. So as teachers, we have to really consider that when we're making that decision on what to teach. So hopefully when you came up with your list of skills that will be essential for our students in the future, that will be shaped by some of the trends that we've been discussing, hopefully you see some overlap between the list you put together and the list that you see in front of you here. In my conversations with students through the years, some of the most common essential skills that students come up with would be things like the communication skills, the interpersonal skills, skills relating to the use of technology. Just a couple of other ones that are on this list that you may or may not have thought of that I want to call your attention to. One is the concept of convergent and divergent thinking. And that's the process of giving students something complex, asking them to break it up into smaller components and then reassemble it in an original way. That is very much a creative thinking process. A lot of times when we think about creativity, we think about art, and obviously artistic creativity is one piece of creativity. But convergent and divergent thinking is the kind of creativity that we can recreate in the STEM classroom, and one that's important. Also, the concept of global understanding and cultural brokerage. I think most of us understand what we mean by global understanding or global awareness. It's just being aware of other cultures, practices, and languages. But cultural brokerage is something a little bit more. It's being able to represent your own culture. So, in this case, being able to represent American culture in an authentic and sincere way, but without being offensive to the receiving culture. And this obviously is becoming more and more important as the prospect of students both going and studying overseas as well as someday working overseas becomes more and more likely. And last but not least, down at the bottom of the list, that delayed gratification is one that a lot of times we don't think of naturally. And that's very, very difficult, particularly for adolescents. It's the concept of being able to work hard now, putting in time and effort now for something that won't pay off 5 or 10 years down the road. It is a skill that is critical for success, particularly in entrepreneurship, and one that teens really, really have a difficult time understanding, and one that we have to try to create opportunities to help them develop that skill. So now we have the big picture, kind of where the question of what do you teach and how do you figure out what you're going to teach. The big picture of where that starts are those economic, scientific, technological, and political trends that we've been talking about. It all starts there. And then it kind of funnels down through the filter you see in front of you to the point where it actually gets to one of your unit or lesson plans. So we've been talking about the big picture of these trends, and really the next step in the what do I teach process are national and state standards. And obviously the Common Core is probably the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, example of that. So national and state standards obviously come from those trends. So committees are put together at the national or state level, and they really do examine economic, scientific, and political trends and try to figure out what skills will be essential for students to succeed in that future. And obviously from there, districts and Board of Educations adopt curriculum guides that are based on those national and state standards. And then you come in and you develop unit and or lesson plans based on your district curriculum guide. So this kind of gives you the idea of the flow for how the question of what do you teach gets answered from the big picture all the way down to your lesson plan. So let's take a minute and talk a little bit about our state standards here in New Jersey. The first thing to know is that state standards are nothing new. I do remember what it was like to teach before there were standards, where boards of education basically could create their own curriculum based on whatever they felt the needs of their individual community was at the time. But in 1996, that all changed. New Jersey came out with their first New Jersey Core Content Curriculum Standards. And since that time, the New Jersey State curriculum has been revised several times: 2003, 2009, 2014, which is the version that we use currently. Now, those standards obviously include the Common Core for math and English language arts, and also include next generation science standards for sciences. And as you may or may not know, the governor has put together a task force right now to actually revise the standards once again. So I wouldn't be surprised if 2016 we see now the fifth generation of New Jersey state standards. But in general, if you look at each of those generation of New Jersey standards, starting from '96 to the present, you will see some trends in the way they've changed. And the first is that they've become more focused, and there are less standards now, and there seem to be less standards with each revision. This is really important in helping teachers kind of focus. The first standards were just so broad. I remember somebody once doing a calculation that it would take something like 22,000 hours if a teacher would actually teach all the material required in the New Jersey state standards in their subject. So they've definitely become more focused. They've also become more aligned with college readiness. The book you see in front of you, College Knowledge, was just one of many pieces that I think was very influential in helping K-12 educators really understand what college readiness was from a real nitty-gritty standpoint in terms of what kinds of reading, writing, and mathematics skills do students need to succeed in college. You actually have an assignment, I think, in this week with an excerpt from that piece as well. So you'll get a taste of what people were reading back then and start to think about how that influenced the standards we have today. And I think the other trend and shift over the years has been an increasing emphasis on higher level thinking skills beyond just memorizing concepts and formulas and terminology. With each standards, particularly with the Common Core, you see a much heavier emphasis on application, students taking content and having to actually do things with them. On the English language arts side, there's a much larger emphasis on argument and students taking a position and learning advanced communication skills to defend their position. So let's take a look at an example of the shift, the kind of shift we're talking about. We'll compare a science standard from 2004 to the standards we currently use for science, and that's the next generation science standards. So in 2004, you see the standard around photosynthesis was explain how plants convert light energy to chemical energy. And for most science teachers, that involved having students memorize or being actually able to draw a diagram of the biochemical process. You see, the next generation standards obviously do require students to understand photosynthesis, but you'll see with the clarification statement and the assessment boundary, it's going beyond students memorizing how to put together the visual diagram and really requiring that they understand what goes into the process and comes out of the process beyond being able to draw or memorize particular steps or terminology in the process. So it's a much higher level thinking process. So as many of you have heard, all of these new standards, we're all heading towards a new national assessment. Common Core was the first set of national standards in this country that were adopted by a significant number of states. And the federal government, actually as part of the Recovery Act in 2007 or 2008, put out a $350 million grant for organizations to create a national assessment for English language arts and mathematics. And two consortiums won. One was called the Smarter Balance, and the other one, which New Jersey adopted, was the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness in College and Careers, or as you know it, PARC. So it's important to note that all of this national curriculum, while it was put together, the concept here was all of it would head towards a national assessment. And this was supposed to help the federal government really level the playing field and compare the performance of educational systems from state to state. Prior to PARC, each state created their own assessment. In New Jersey, the high school assessment was the HESPA. Some of you may have actually taken the HESPA. And the problem with that is, with every state taking their own test, the federal government had a hard time comparing the performance state to state. As you know, PARCC has become very controversial. It started out with 24 states adopting it, and I think as of today we're down to 7. And the future for PARCC in New Jersey is really uncertain after 2021. So we'll have to keep an eye on this and see where things go from here. So let's talk a little bit about where all of this push for national standards and a push for standards that are really require higher level thinking process, where this all came from. And it really came from back to some of the trends that we've been talking about, changing skill demands in our job market, and a projection that we were going to have a large number of service-based jobs that required a lot of intellectual capital, and that we were not going to have the required number of qualified graduates to fill these positions. So let's take a look at the changing needs of our national workforce. The graph you see in front of you, which compares data from 1973 as compared to 2007, and what it's charting are the jobs out there and the kinds of education they require. And what you see in the light purple and dark purple, those are the jobs that a high school graduate or someone with less than a high school diploma could fulfill. You see, in 1973 it was considerable, about 72% of the jobs out there. But you see, by 2007 that had gone down to 41%, and the projection is that that will continue to drop. So we are on a trend, a trajectory of having a higher and higher percent of our jobs requiring at least some college, occupational certifications, bachelor's degrees, or higher. Now, if you take a look at the current state of our workforce, particularly focusing on eligible employees in their early to mid-20s, you'll see that only 40% of them actually have the credentials that match where the vast majority of the jobs seem to be going. So our current workforce doesn't have the capacity. So the next question then is, if you look at our educational system, are we doing a better job at helping more and more students earn these credentials so that they will be qualified for the majority of these jobs? And if you look at college completion rates around the country, the answer to that question, unfortunately, is no. I think most of us actually are aware that at four-year colleges and universities, only about half of the students who start actually graduate. What's more surprising are the low completion rates of students at our two-year community colleges, where there it's actually below 30%. So it puts us in a real predicament, in the sense that we don't have the current potential employees with the right educational credentials. And if you look at our educational system and our college completion rates, we really don't, if you project it out, it doesn't appear that we're going to be pumping out the right number of potential job candidates to fulfill these jobs. So this really is where a lot of the new push in state standards, particularly Common Core, came from. It really came out of this concern that we really needed to increase the college readiness of our K-12 students in order to address these poor completion rates at four-year schools, and particularly at two-year community colleges. If you look at the high dropout rate at community colleges, if you talk to college presidents in particular, and you try to figure out what's at the heart of this problem, most of them will say that we have high school students in New Jersey passing the high school exit exam, which has been the HESPA. And I actually saw this phenomena at one of our high schools, where students would pass the HESPA, go on, graduate from high school, go to a school like Bergen Community College, and fail the placement exam there in language arts and mathematics, which at Bergen Community was something called the AccuPlacer, which was a college board assessment. So that was proof that there was definitely a gap between what we were deeming as the end of K-12 and what the colleges considered to be college ready. So that really was, I think, the precedent and the catalyst for things like the Common Core to really make sure that our K-12 sequence represented true. So what resources are available out there for you to help you align your learning objectives with different grade levels in your courses? Well, the first thing out there in New Jersey is something called the New Jersey Model Curriculum. You see the URL up there. What this does is it actually takes the standards, Common Core standards and Next Gen standards, and breaks them down into grade levels to help you and help school districts kind of figure out what should be covered in ninth grade, 10th grade, and etc. This is obviously particularly important in terms of preparation for the PARCC assessments, as the PARCC assessments go by grade level as well. So this curriculum map in front of you helps you kind of get a feel for what curriculum is at all different levels, right? So obviously it starts with Common Core standards, and districts use resources like the New Jersey Model Curriculum to break those standards into grade levels for grade level courses. All courses get broken down into units, and all units get broken down into lesson plans. Now, depending upon the district you're at, some districts require teachers to submit unit plans for review when they're being observed, and other districts require teachers to submit lesson plans, and I think there are even some districts out there that require both. The term curriculum is a nebulous one at best. It can mean a lot of different things. I've seen some districts where curriculum is nothing more than a list of state standards, and I've seen other districts where curriculum is extremely detailed and contains all of the things listed on the screen in front of you. But in general, I think you'll find that most districts' curriculums start out with the state standards, in the sense that those are the learning outcomes that the course is built around. And then it will also provide a series of assessments or benchmark assessments that students will have to take in order to show proficiency in that course. And the curriculum may also contain some sample learning activities for students. But we're going to actually be doing an activity in this course where we'll take a look at curriculum from different districts, and you will see a lot of variety, to say the least, in terms of the amount of information that districts will give to you as a teacher in a curriculum guide. So to wrap this all up, I'd like you to reflect back on all of the trends that we've examined here, and you will see a post titled "The Most Significant Trend." And I'd like you to explain to us which of these trends you think will have the largest impact on your teaching in the STEM classroom and why.